And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Machuda.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today. Lots of stuff going on in the dojo, where, of course, we learn how to explain, defend the faith in clarity and charity and confidence. Our good friend, Dr. Douglas Beaumont, is going to be joining us. We're going to look at apologetics in a new way, his way. And I think it's really great because, we're familiar with apologetics being a three-tiered system where you have theistic apologetics on the bottom, the questions about the existence of God, his attributes. Then you have Christian apologetics where whether Christ is Son of God and Messiah, the reliability of Scripture, how Christianity differs from all other world religions. Then on the top of the pyramid, you have Catholic apologetics, which is what's the true church? Is the Catholic Church the true church? Well, Dr. Beaumont's going to come on, and he kind of gives a more nuanced view of that because, quite frankly, the world has changed, and there's a lot more to apologetics than just establishing those 3 points. And so he wrote a great article. It's called My Apologetics Method. It's available on douglasbeaumont.com, his website. And that's what we're going to work through today. That is lots of really cool information, great insights. Before I forget, I should also mention that tomorrow, for those who live in the southeast Michigan area, I'm going to be at the Midwest Catholic Apologetics Conference there in Sterling Heights at St. Cyril and Methodius. I'm going to be promoting Virgin Most Powerful Radio, selling books, handing out, Virgin Most Powerful cards, doing all that kind of stuff. So if you're going to this conference, stop by, say hello to the sensei. It'd be great to see you. Here in Southeast Michigan, we have such an incredible community of people, Catholics who are committed to explaining, defending the faith. And these conferences are really great. This year's conference focused on pro-life apologetics. And so I'll be there giving a plug for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And, who knows? Maybe we could rub elbows, so to speak. Anything else? Let's see. Yes, that would be tomorrow. Just go on St. Cyril and Methodius. I think it's .com. Or just look up Midwest Catholic Apologetics Conference. And you'll get all the information right there. Let's see. Well, what else am I forgetting? Oh, I need to give my shout-outs to all those watching live stream on Facebook, YouTube. Hello, folks. Welcome aboard. It's great to have you with us, and I also want to welcome all of you listening via radio around the country and also around the world. It's great to have you on board and do this thing that we call Hands-On Apologetics. Every episode, as you know, we jump into a critical thinking exercise. Today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is one of the biggies, one of the main fallacies that's out there. It's called the non sequitur fallacy. And we also meet an early church father. Today's early church father, by the way, is St. Gregory of Nyssa. So got great stuff in store for us. So why don't we join in and dig into the Finding of the Fallacy, shall we? Today's Finding of the Fallacy, by the way, is the non sequitur fallacy. It's basically means, it's a fancy word, which just simply means it does not follow. Okay, so a non sequitur is something that doesn't follow. It's a pattern of reasoning rendered invalid by a flaw in the logical structure that can neatly be expressed in a standard logical system. For example, propositional logic. That's the technical language. Basically what it means is if you're making an argument and the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises, that is what we call a non sequitur, right? So if you argue, for example, that there are many bad Catholics throughout history, there are many bad clerics throughout history, therefore Jesus didn't establish the church, that is a non sequitur because it doesn't follow from the premises. Why couldn't Christ's church include sinners? In fact, it does. So that's what you need to do in order to detect a non sequitur and call it out. You need to pay close attention to the premises of the argument. What do the premises support and what do they not support? Just because somebody will conclude with something, it doesn't necessarily follow that the conclusion follows from the premises. Okay? You always have to stop and say, okay, is that true given what the argument says? And if the answer is no, then you call it a non sequitur. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our founding the fallacy for today. All right, let's jump to the Meet the Early Church Father for today. He's a biggie. It is St. Gregory of Nyssa. St. Gregory, by the way, is the younger brother of Basil the Great, Basil of Caesarea. He was born about the year 335 AD, and the third of the three great Cappadocian fathers. Unlike Basil, who was very good at administration and leadership, and unlike Gregory of Nazianzus, who was particularly attractive preacher, Gregory of Nyssa had none of those qualities whatsoever. But he was extraordinarily gifted as a mystic, a theologian, and a writer. In fact, in the versatility of his writings, he far surpasses and also the other Gregory. Gregory was educated for the most part by his older brother Basil. After having advanced in the church as far as a lector, he decided on a worldly career as a teacher in rhetoric. He married. The other Gregorys convinced him to retire to Basil's monastery on the Iris. And on autumn 371, Basil, trying to consolidate his ecclesiastical authority as metropolitan, consecrated Gregory, Bishop of Nyssa, and just as he was entering the other Gregory in Sesamus. Gregory of Nyssa, like Gregory Nazianzus, was consecrated rather much against his preferences, and if literally against his will. Nyssa, however, at least agreed to take possession of a see, which was not the case with Gregory of Nazianzus. And Basil criticized and blamed him rather constantly for his lack of firmness, political, ecclesiastical unfitness, and poor fiscal administration. But nevertheless, Gregory, like I said, he was a writer and a mystic, and he was also foremost, he contended against the considerable opposition of the Arians, who falsely accused him of misappropriating funds, and in the Synod of Nyssa in 376 deposed him in absentia. But when the Gregory Valens died 2 years later, Gregory was able to return back to his see in Nyssa. In 379, the Synod of Antioch made him a visitor in the Pontus, and while he was on mission, he was in 380 elected Bishop of Sebaste. In 381 in Constantinople, he was outspoken in his defense of Gregory of Nazianzus. And we find him again in Constantinople to preach a funeral homily over the Princess Pruchilla in 385. And shortly afterwards, he did the same for his mother. He also delivered his address. And it's really at the present synod convened in Constantinople in 394, where that's the last we hear of Gregory of Nyssa alive on earth. And so that gives theologians the impression that that's probably where he died. So he was born somewhere around AD 335, died sometime around 394. And, of course, he's one of the three great Cappadocian fathers. We've talked about all three on the show, Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, and also Gregory of Nazianzus. So that is our early church father for today. And you know what? It just occurred to me that I didn't give out the phone number and mail. So I got to do that right now before I forget. If you have any questions for Dr. Beaumont on the other side of the break, give us a call toll-free at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. Or you can email us. And, we got lots of emails coming in. Great questions, great scenarios. I do answer every email. And you're asking yourself, well, what is the address to the Dojo mailbox? Well, let me tell you, it is questions@handsonapologetics.com. By the way, that's the best way to get a hold of me. That goes directly to my email. I do answer every question, and we have some great emails in store. In fact, I'm working on a new format where maybe every show I'm going to answer an email and kind of thin out the mailbox a little bit. But I also like doing shows that are dedicated strictly to emails, just because there's just so many really interesting questions that come up. It's fun to do it in block rather than just one question at a time. That's just my own personal opinion, but being the host and sensei of the program, it's the opinion that matters. So anyway, yeah. So send your questions to question@handsonapologetics.com, and we will answer that. Boy, I have this sneaky suspicion that I forgot something, but I can't think of what it is. So since my trusty engineer has not whispered anything into my headphones, I'll just continue. So on the other side of the break, we're going to have Dr. Douglas Beaumont, and we're going to talk about this really cool article. Check it out, folks. Go to DouglasBeaumont.com and just look up this article. It was May 21st, 2014. It's called My Apologetic Method. And kind of follow the show with it, because it has some great graphs and kind of spells out all the particulars of it. But basically, Dr. Beaumont's going to share with us a kind of breakdown of how to understand apologetics as a system. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And let's see, and he'll be coming up on the other side of the break. And I hear the music. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be talking with Dr. Beaumont in a few seconds. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics. I'm Gary Machuda. We'll be right back.
This is Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. This March, VMPR, in association with the Catholic Resource Center, will be hosting a special conference for the Adoramus Society. Adoramus at the Triduum, a conference on the spirituality of the Triduum liturgies, featuring speakers Father Joseph Fessio, Dr. Anthony Lillis, and Christopher Karstens, addressing such topics as developing a liturgical spirituality, the spirituality of Holy Thursday, the spirituality of Good Friday, and the spirituality of the Paschal Vigil and Easter season. It all takes place March 14, 2020, at the historic Sacred Heart Chapel at 381 West Center Street, Covina, California, 91723. You can register online at vmpr.org or call now at 877-526-2151 to reserve your seat today for Adoramus at the Triduum. Leviticus 11:44 says, "Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." St. Vincent Pallotti said, "You must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy." God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands on Apologetics. And if you're like me and you've been in the field of apologetics for a number of years, you know that there's a classical way of understanding the discipline, and there's a lot to be there's need for modification of that classical view. And to help us kind of work through that, we have none other than Dr. Douglas Beaumont. Dr. Beaumont received his PhD in theology from Northwest University and MA in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. He's a convert to the faith and the author of an excellent book called Evangelical Exodus, Evangelical Seminarians and Their Path to Rome, and other books as well. And he's also a popular speaker. He's a catechist and director of religious ed. And you can check out all his great writings and other activity at www.douglasbeaumont.com. And Dr. Beaumont, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Hey, Gary. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, this is a fun topic because as I was reading your article, I was thinking, yeah, this is how I used to learn, from the old books from the 30s, 40s, apologetics is just theistic apologetics, Christian apologetics, Catholic apologetics, but so much has changed over the years. We really need to take a fresh look at what exactly is apologetics.
Yeah, I think there's been a number of changes, some rediscoveries, some certain groups that have produced even their own apologetic systems that have arisen in the last couple of generations. So it's not something that can just be taken for granted anymore. Someone who is going to really involve themselves in the defense of the faith has a number of options out there that they need to consider. And oftentimes it seems like apologetics is figuring out which apologetic system one's going to adopt. But, I think that there are some good pointers. There's good features of a lot of them. And, just coming to grips with your own system and understanding why you do it the way you do it can be really important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's not your father's Oldsmobile, I guess you could say. There's lots of new options and things you could have on it. So why don't you start with give us an overview, to the basic overview, and then we'll get into the particulars.
Sure. Yeah. So typically in I call them like the big three systems that exist out there that are at least getting the most airtime, even if they're not historically terribly relevant. All of them would be what is typically referred to now as classical apologetics, which is the closest to what I follow and what I think the typical Christian expects from your more scholastic academic apologists. They'll typically be thinking about classical. And then you have kind of a subset of classical apologetics where the focus becomes very much on what I would consider the third step of apologetics, which is looking at the evidence for Christianity in particular. The way evidential apologists typically approach the subject is by looking at the evidence for Christianity first and then kind of deriving some of the other conclusions that classical apologetics tries to prove along the way from the fact of Christianity. So, for example, if you prove that Christianity is true, well, then the Bible must be true and there must be a God, because that's just part of Christianity. So it's kind of just a different direction than classical apologetics takes, which is more of a build-up to the truth of Christianity from a different starting point. And then third, you have the vastly minority view, but a very loud minority, which is presuppositional apologetics. And this you pretty much only find in your strongly reformed circles. It's no more than 2 generations old. But the idea behind presuppositional apologetics is that you really begin with what they would consider a biblical, scriptural, Christian, whatever you want to call it, worldview. And then rather than try to build up to that worldview as the conclusion of the apologetic system, you start there, and then the apologist's job is really to just show how any other worldview doesn't work because it's just incoherent. It kind of defeats itself. So those are your big three.
Okay. Now, are those applicable to each level? I know that's applicable for theistic apologetics. Is it just as applicable to like Catholic apologetics and Christian?
Yeah, I would say that once you actually watch these different types of apologetic methods in action, sometimes it's very difficult to tell them apart. You might look at an evangelical like Gary Habermas or his protege Michael Licona. They're pretty much the 2 most famous apologists out there right now for the resurrection of Christ. I mean, if you want to know about the resurrection of Christ. Academically, maybe you're going to look at N.T. Wright. But as far as apologists go, Gary and Michael, they're it. Now, they would each be considered evidential apologists. In other words, if you invited Gary Habermas or Michael Licona to a debate with an atheist, they would probably begin with the resurrection of Christ, showing that if Christ indeed can be historically proven to be resurrected, well, then God must exist because he's the only explanation for that historical event. So once you're actually, like if you walked into the debate 10 minutes in, what Michael Licona is doing might be the exact same thing that somebody like a Richard Howe or a Norman Geisler would do, even though they're classical apologists. But by the time they get to a certain level in the argument, they're going to use the same evidential arguments that an evidentialist would use. They're just not going to open up with that. And the same, I would say, for presuppositional apologetics. There are a number of, I think, very useful arguments in the presuppositional system that can be used to expose somebody's faulty worldview. It's just that we're not limiting ourselves as classical apologists to just those kinds of methods. The presuppositionalist is going to say that to depart from those kinds of arguments is actually unbiblical. So they're actually quite vociferous in their defense of their system, whereas the evidentialist and the classicalists can kind of shrug their shoulders and say, 10 minutes into the debate, we might be doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah. How can a presuppositionalist say that when Jesus says, if you don't believe me, believe my works? Isn't that evidentiary?
Yeah. One of the difficulties, and I was just reading an article recently on this, is that, of all the groups out there that are going to claim, to come from the Bible alone and with respect for Scripture higher than anything else, it's odd that the presuppositionalists don't have anyone in the Bible actually doing what they're doing. In every example that we have in Scripture, the kind of apologetics that gets done is starting from a point where the classicalist or even the evidentialist would start. I think it really has more to do with the audience. Paul, for St. Paul, for example, we can see how he did apologetics with the Jews who already believed in the existence of God and had a healthy respect for sacred scripture. But he did a very different thing when he did apologetics with the pagan Greeks who didn't necessarily believe in a single creator God and certainly did not have any respect for Jewish sacred scripture. And what you see is him doing two completely different things. So I think that what the classical model does is it says, look, there's a couple different starting points, and we need to be able to start where someone is and go up from there. And that seems to be the picture that takes into all the biblical data. But what you never see is the presuppositional format where they're kind of saying, oh, yeah, well, you can't even object to God without there being a God. This sort of, apologetic jujitsu that they try to do to go off your theme. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, but we certainly don't have any examples of anyone doing it in the Bible. You don't see it in the writings of the church fathers. You don't even see it in the writings of Protestants. It was literally invented by Cornelius Van Til in the 20th century because he basically looked at apologetics and said, this doesn't really seem to go very well with my theology. There must be a different way to do apologetics that fits this really strong Calvinistic Reformed theology, and presuppositional apologetics came into existence. So it really was just like this historical novum in the Christian world.
So that's interesting. There's these different approaches to essentially the same kind of structure. Each one has their own sweet spot, I imagine, and weakness, right? I mean,
sure. I think that just to go down the line, I mean, the weakness of the presuppositional approach, I think, besides just not being found in Scripture or much of church history, is just the fact that you don't really get to where they want you to go. Presuppositionalists do pretty well if you follow their particular philosophy when it comes to arguments for theism, but I've never really seen a presuppositionalist do very well going beyond theism to Christianity as such. I don't think you need the Bible for logic to make sense. I don't think you need the Trinity to solve the kinds of problems they have and no objective truth. And you just don't really seem to need Christianity for that. Maybe you could argue that you need God for that, but that just gets you to theism, which ironically is the complaint that the presuppositionalist has against the classicalist. I actually took a class on a presuppositional apologetics at Reformed Theological Seminary back east. And the first 90% of the class was just bagging on classical apologetics and how, it just gets you this vanilla God, it never gets you to the Trinity. Well, when the class was almost over and we'd finally gotten around to the transcendental argument and these kinds of things, I sat there and thought, a Muslim could agree with all of this. I mean, a Muslim could be a presuppositionalist just as easily as a Christian.
Yeah. So
I raised my hand and I said, you've been complaining about this vanilla God all this time. When are we going to get to the Neapolitan God? I want to know how to get to the Trinity doing all this judo that you're doing. And he just kind of waved his hand and said, well, the problem of the one and the many. And wait, what? Like that, the Trinity doesn't help with that at all. And that was basically the end of the class. So I think that its weak point is that it never actually gets you to Christianity. It's just stipulated that Christianity has to be your starting point or else nothing else makes sense. And I just don't think that's true.
Yeah, that's good. In fact, that's exactly what I think. It works well in a binary system where either God exists or doesn't exist. There's no middle ground. But once you move from that to multiple things, then it really kind of falls apart.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. If it's down to just black and white theism versus atheism, sure, I think you can get a lot of headway there. But you can get a lot of headway with classical too, and it's the way that people in the Bible seem to do it. It's the way that it's been done throughout church history. And I think it just makes a lot more sense. It's interesting how few presuppositional apologists actually go out and do apologetics. I mean, how many debates have you seen with a presuppositionalist? It's very rare. It's hard to find any good examples. And I think it's because when they finally do get on stage and debate somebody, usually the other people just have no idea what they're talking about, because this is just such a non-intuitive method. People just don't think like this. And they can blame that on sin if they want to, but the fact of the matter is the vast majority of Christianity has never taken a presuppositional stance. And then just to bring up evidentialism, I think evidentialism works very well at a certain stage. I think that the difficulty is that proving a historical event doesn't necessarily prove that God exists.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about apologetics and all its different flavors. Stay tuned. More to come on the other side of the break.
We finally did it. We have a Catholic Mental Health Conference on April 25th, 2020, here at the Sacred Heart Chapel with Dr. Louis Sandoval. He's going to be speaking on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Number one, he's going to go on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Second hour, depression, anxiety versus oppression and obsession. The third hour, bipolar disorders. Oh my gosh, infestation and possession. We're going to talk on mental health with the spiritual aspect. Number 4 talk will be on drug use, altered mental status versus demonic influence. I want to hear that talk. I hope you do too. Go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call us at 877-526-2151. The date is April 25th, 2020. Be there by calling 877-526-2151. God bless you. This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about apologetics and kind of modifying it, updating it, kind of giving a survey of the land. And, Dr. Beaumont, like when I first started, the ground floor was theism. You just started with proofs for the existence of God and then worked your way up to Christian apologetics. But, in the last decade or so, I realized that there's a need for a ground floor even before you get to theism, because not everybody starts off with truths that you would think would be common sense, like reality exists, there's an extra mental world, things like that.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a basement to the two-story building that
Yeah, right.
in many cases gets ignored. We should all be very much in debt to Dr. Norman Geisler for this, because I think he was really the first to both notice this and incorporate this step. He kind of put an additional step into what he called the classical apologetics two-step. That basically, with some people, you start with God and you start giving them arguments like, well, we know this and we know that, and we can look at the stars, and we can, you start giving them maybe science, or maybe you go a little bit more in depth and do like a philosophical argument for God. And then at some point you just get, well, that might be true for you. I actually remember this happening when I was in college, long time ago, back in the 90s, where, I went into this evangelistic situation with this friend of mine, and we're talking to this guy, and he's nodding and smiling, and I'm thinking, oh, great, we're really making some headway here. And then all of a sudden he just goes, man, that's just really great that that's true for you. It's just not true for me. And it just totally threw me for a loop. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what does that sentence even mean?
Yeah. And
that was kind of my introduction into postmodernism, and just this kind of agnostic skepticism about reality. And it honestly just didn't make sense to me at all. I couldn't even really, I found myself having difficulty even thinking like this person. But then I finally realized that, people are taking seriously the idea that they're just kind of in this bubble of reality that isn't necessarily the same bubble that somebody else has. Of course, holding to that means that you've got a bubble with a bunch of bubbles in it. So
yeah, right.
Everybody ultimately believes in one reality. So what Geisler did was he said, okay, we got to back up a step. And first we have to establish some things that even make evidence and philosophy useful. Because if objective reality doesn't exist, or if it does, but we can't know it directly, well, then everything I say may just be wrong. It may be that I'm in my matrix and you're in yours. And of course, popular Hollywood films, by the end of the 90s, I mean, you've got dozens of these films that are just questioning basic reality. Do we really know we're not in a dream? Do we really know we're not in the matrix?
Yeah. And
if you take those kinds of things seriously, well, then it's very easy to just dismiss any evidence, whether it's scientific or historical or anything else. And, while there aren't really very many real philosophers that took postmodernism seriously, it did come out a lot in the arts and in your, English departments. And unfortunately, people that are in those departments don't really maybe have the philosophical knowledge to realize how totally self-defeating these kinds of ideas are. So I think that for the classical apologists, we do need to at least be ready to deal with someone who's ready to just dump all the evidence because, well, I don't even know if you're here, man. You get somebody like that, you do need to be able to deal with that.
Yeah. In fact, let me throw this in. This was a strange email I got years ago where a fellow emailed me and said, I keep getting kicked off Catholic forums. I'm a good Catholic, but for some reason they get angry and they kick me off. So I said, okay, well, let's chat. And he was saying things like, well, there's 12 apostles, and they all had their different views about Jesus. So who's to say Peter's view of Jesus is right and Andrew's is wrong? And the more I worked with him, I realized he had that bubble universe type thing that, it's like each apostle had their own understanding of Jesus, their own reality, and that's why people were giving arguments for papal authority and things like that, when it actually was a lot more fundamental error of, whether there is a unified reality that we all can understand and know.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is something to, maybe the gospel differences and, how many angels were at the tomb and that kind of thing. But yeah, when you're getting down to the level of just basic reality, how can we know anything? That's not something that science or history or even theology can really address. You've got to be able to deal with that person at the kind of purely philosophical level. And so that's why, I think kind of the basement or the bottom, the first step, you at least need to be prepared for some of the philosophical problems that are going to come from a total relativist.
Yeah, very good. So is the basement basically epistemology, how we know? Is that pretty much the realm of this basement level?
It could be epistemology or metaphysics. It just sort of depends on what the precise problem is. I'm a devotee of Thomas Aquinas, and he wouldn't make metaphysics and epistemology even two different subjects. They're essentially the same thing, because his epistemology is based on what he thinks reality is made up of. But even if we don't get into the weeds there, are you a Platonist, Aristotelian, that kind of thing, just the basic self-defeating nature of saying it's true that there is no truth. The reality of the situation that I know is that we don't know reality. Usually, if you just let these people talk long enough, they'll take care of the arguments. You just need to point them out.
Yeah, right.
So it's almost more of just kind of a debate skill than necessarily going out and getting a degree in philosophy. That isn't really necessary to deal with this level. It's really more of the just the skill of noticing, you just said something that defeats itself, and now I'm going to point that out, or I'm going to ask a question in a certain way that opens your eye. Oh, yeah, I just said something that doesn't make any sense. So it's interesting that in the late 90s, early 2000s, you have a number of apologetics books coming out that are really just dealing with that topic. I mean, they don't even get into whether God exists or whether or not Christianity is the religion that God started. They're just trying to get you to see that, okay, reality is out there, people. The evidence that I give you for my views is evidence that you have to take seriously. You can't just sweep it under the rug of agnosticism, because any claim you make is a claim to knowing truth and reality. So if any attack you make on truth and reality, necessarily going to explode on itself.
Yeah, very good. So you kind of have to lay down, what is truth? Is there a thing called reality? Can we know things truly? That type of stuff needs to be sorted out before you move to the proofs for the existence of God, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of the proofs for God are either going to typically come from philosophy or science. Well, of course, science is, empiricism. It's purely what can be observed. So if you're calling your senses into question, well, then science goes right out the door.
Right.
And then again, philosophically, there's certain things we can take a look at in mathematics. There's certain things we can take a look at with causality, but all of that ultimately derives from our sense experience as well. So there really is a need to make sure we can kind of deal with that matrix objection, and settle that and move on before we move on to the other arguments. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to start there. I think some people get a little confused by classical apologetics that, well, it's this 3-step system and you have to start at step 1. No, you can come into the building anywhere you want. If I'm arguing with a Muslim, a committed Muslim, I don't need to deal with truth because he's Muslim. He already thinks there's true and false. I don't have to deal with the existence of God because he already believes in the existence of a creator God. Great, we're already at step 3.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I teach this, I laughingly tell people, if you run into someone who isn't a Christian because they're an atheist, hey, rejoice, man, you're already at step 2.
Right, yeah.
You've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so don't assume you have to always start in the basement. You can just zip to wherever the person is, and thank God that they're there, because that's not necessarily the case. I think you have to sniff out, whether there's some sort of incoherence to their thinking, and then maybe work your way down, until you hit that part where something's not quite right.
Yeah, and the beauty of this 3-step system is that it's very movable. You can be talking about the resurrection, and then someone goes, "Well, how do we even know history is true?" Okay, well, we're back to step 1. Let's deal with that. We'll pop back up to this when we're finished. I might skip over God's existence because maybe for them it is between Christianity and atheism. Okay. And so at that point, a more evidentialist approach will work. But we just need to make sure that we're able to go up and down through the levels. And I think that that's one thing with evidentialist apologetics is you don't really see them arguing strongly against classical or something like I do. They're usually very movable as well. They're not going to say, no, you can't ever give an argument for the existence of God. You have to start with, the resurrection. It's the presuppositional approach that really is contrary to the other systems.
Interesting. Yeah. So, now, I've seen apologists jump straight to the resurrection and argue that if Christ was raised from the dead, then God must exist. Is that a valid way of arguing?
I don't think it's invalid. I think that it opens itself to a huge objection, which is just that, the resurrection itself is really more of a theological issue. History can say there was a guy named Jesus. This guy named Jesus was dead. Later, this guy named Jesus was alive. Okay, so that's kind of your basic minimal facts approach that somebody like Dr. Habermas or Lacona would use. And then it's just more of an argument to the best explanation. Like how else does a dead person come alive later? I suppose the weakness there would be that somebody could come up with some naturalistic explanation. I mean, granted, it would be highly suspect. Given the claims that Jesus made and the beliefs of the early church, it's definitely an ad hoc kind of argument to say, well, maybe Jesus rose from the dead some other way. Well, okay, but you're really pushing it there.
Yeah.
But I suppose that a hardened atheist could get into, well, maybe aliens raised Jesus from the dead, or maybe he was just magical, or you could bring in the ridiculous swoon theory, just kind of amplified somehow. And of course, and Jesus isn't the only one that ever raised from the dead. If the Bible's true, lots of people rose from the dead. I mean, they weren't resurrected theologically. They were just dead and then alive. But again, that's all that history can really show us. So when it comes to theological topics like that, I think it's really handy to have God in place and then use evidential apologetics to say which one of these religions did God start. I think, to me, that's a much more conservative claim. It's a lot easier to prove. But trying to say, here's a religion that's true, therefore God exists, I think that is a little more open to retort.
Very good. We're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about apologetics. Stay tuned.
Hello, this is Terry Barber with the Terry and Jesse Show. I'm here with Gil Already. He is the president of the Catholic Men's Fellowship of California. Gil, we got a men's conference coming up.
I appreciate you having me on, Terry, to share about our Rise Up, O Men of God, The Church for You Does Wait, Super Saturday Conference, and it's Saturday, March 28th in Covina at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, 344 West Workman Street in Covina, California.
Who are the speakers?
We have some great speakers lined up. We have Steve Ruda, former captain of the LA Fire Department. He's dynamic. He's energetic. He will really keep the conference moving. We have Monsignor Tim Nichols, the pastor from St. John Vianney's. He's dynamic. Mark McElrath, Father Darren Merlino, a trained exorcist. Charlie Eshelman, a past Navy SEAL. We have Deacon Omar Uriati, who is from our parish, St. Louis de Marillac, and Father Joseph Shea.
And I'll be there myself, giving a little plug for Virgin Most Powerful.
You can reach us at catholicmen.org. Tickets are on sale there. Just follow the link. Tickets are on sale at eventbrite.com. Just be sure to get your tickets now till the 31st for $35 and $45 after that till the day of the conference.
Sign up for this men's conference. Call Gil at 626-841-9090.
I'll be sure to answer your call and give you all the information you need for the Rise Up, O Men of God, for You, the Church Does Wait conference. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate your help.
God bless you.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. I hope you're having as much fun as I am nerding out talking about apologetics with the one person that would be the most fun to nerd out with on the topic, and that is Dr. Douglas Beaumont. This is a lot of fun.
Do we get along so well? We're both apologetics nerds.
That must be it, you know.
It would explain a lot.
That's right. So I've heard of the nutrition pyramid, you know, the food pyramid. Let's talk about the apologetics pyramid.
Yeah. So early on in my seminary career, I'm not 100% sure that this is mine. I may have to give some credit to Richard Howe, who was one of the professors at SES. But I've definitely tweaked it enough to kind of make it my own. But what I started using when I was presenting apologetics was kind of a pyramid shape, but I made it into a prism because I like the idea that, you know, it's kind of a reverse prism. But, you know, out there in the world, you've got atheism, you've got Buddhism, you've got, you know, Islam, you've got so many different religions, non-religions, different worldviews. And, you know, I know for me, when I didn't become a Christian until I was an adult, just this plethora of possibilities out there was enough to keep me skeptical, because I just thought, how could anybody claim to know the truth when there's so many different competing claims out there? I mean, if you look at the number of religions, I mean, it's just insane. I don't have time to figure all this out. And I don't think anybody else has had time to figure it out. So I'll just do my own thing. Well, as I got into apologetics, I started realizing that, you know, really Christianity just kind of narrows down to just a few basic truths. You know, if reality is knowable and gives us evidence, well, then we can use it to see whether God exists or not. And if there is a God, and I mean the God of classical theism, the simple, all-powerful, infinite creator, if that God exists, well then right off the bat, every religion, every worldview, every system of man in existence in the world that denies the existence of a single, all-powerful creator God has to be wrong, just by definition. Well, that clears the table of just about every other option out there. There's really only a few religions that actually, you know, wholeheartedly teach that this God exists. Okay, so then it becomes a matter of, if God exists, what religion, which one of these competing religions did he create, did he form? And I believe that, you know, the only way to really know that would be to look at some piece of evidence that only God could produce. Now, this is the way God did it in the Bible. You know, when Moses says, how are they going to believe that of all the gods of Egypt, you know, you're the one talking? He says, well, do some miracles, right? But it also just makes sense philosophically, I think, that if I want to prove that I am the creator of something, then I have to have something in that thing that nobody else can produce. Fingerprint, signature, you know, there's got to be something that at least allegedly can't be faked. And with God, what is that? Well, it's going to be miracles. Any man can make up a religion. So we can't just use the fact that a man wrote some stuff in a book and we happen to like it to mean that that religion is true. But if God wants to put his fingerprints, if you will, on that faith, he can do so by backing up his message with miracles. And when you look at the big three, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, those are the ones that are still on the table after we've proven that God exists. Well, Judaism has miracles, we know that, but Judaism is incorporated into Christianity, and even if you want to see them as competing, Christianity has far greater miracles for support. So if you're going to accept the miracles of Judaism, you kind of have to accept the miracles of Christianity. when it comes to Islam, interestingly, in the Quran itself, Muhammad is asked to do miracles like Moses or Jesus, because that's just what God's messengers do, and his people recognize that. And it's recorded in the Quran that Muhammad doesn't do any miracles.
Right.
He's actually asked to, and he doesn't pull it off. He says the Quran is his miracle, which is like the greatest circular argument of all time. So, okay, well, what are we left with? Judeo-Christianity. So it actually is this idea of the prism is that, yeah, there's a million different non-Christian things out there, but they all kind of pass through this filter of reality, of theism, whether God exists, and then the historical reality of miracles. And really only one thing comes out the other end of that filter, and that's Christianity.
Yeah. If I could throw a pitch at you, how would deism fit in this? Because they believe in a creator God, but that the God doesn't reveal himself through positive revelation.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So with deism, I mean, deism is kind of almost more of a movement. You don't really have like a church of deism,
Yeah, good point.
The third deist church of Dallas.
Reformed.
So I would say, theism and deism basically both kind of make it through step 2, right? Okay. Because all we need is a creator God, and they've got one. Now, if there were no religions that had miraculous support, well, then I would say deism is going to make it through, and we're going to be kind of done at that point where it's okay, well, pick a religion that has a God and you're good to go. But because there are historically proven miracles that back up Christianity, but deism doesn't have any, obviously. Right. In fact, the whole religion is based around not having miracles. And the fact that you don't have miracles recorded in the Quran, and that Islam, without question, got started without miracles, even though later ahadith report miracles of Muhammad, like cutting the moon in half with his sword and riding a horse into heaven. None of those launched the movement. And they might even be seen to kind of contradict what the Quran reports. So I would say that deism and theism both make it past step 1. They both make it past step 2. But just like Judaism and Islam, once you get to step 3, Christianity comes right back into focus.
Yeah, very good. I never could understand why deists deny the possibility of revelation. It almost seemed like a ad hoc, we can have our cake and eat it too type thing. We'll have the creator God, but not all these pesky, divine revelation type things.
Yeah, I actually had a really great conversation with an actual real live living deist a number of years ago. I was kind of shocked. I thought, once Thomas Jefferson died, that pretty much died out, but apparently they're still around. And it is interesting because through step 1 and 2, they sound just like classical apologists. In step 3, they sound just like atheists. So yeah, it is kind of a weird combination. They're absolutely as skeptical of the Bible as an atheist is, but as far as like basic morality and metaphysics and stuff, they can track with you right up until that point. So I don't know. There's probably some deists that maybe try to have a philosophical objection to miracles, but to the ones that I have heard, it's more historical. Like they just don't believe that it happened.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Well, I'm sorry to sidetrack your climb up the pyramid.
That's a great example of how it works. That really everything fits in there somewhere.
Yes, absolutely. So if God exists, then miracles are possible. If miracles can be used to confirm God's message. And then I guess the next part would be whether or not miracles that are purported in the New Testament actually occurred.
Right. So all of that would happen, what I would consider during step 3. So step 3 is really where we say, okay, let's get down to the miracles. Did they happen or not? And so this is where the resurrection becomes very important. This is where the rise of Christianity itself becomes very important. Because like Thomas Aquinas said, if Christianity, which had nothing going for it in the culture of the day, if Christianity actually got started without miracles, well, then Christianity itself would be the greatest of miracles. So there's some very strong historical evidence that at least some miracles happened. We don't necessarily need to go through and list every miracle and say that every single one of them has exact same amount of proof, but once you agree that the resurrection happened, it doesn't really matter if many of the other ones. I think we talked last time about Jesus' prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem. That's a great miracle, sure, and I think it certainly serves a purpose. But I think that the resurrection apologetics are really where the money's at right now.
Yeah, very good. So, and then Jesus' claim to be God, which we've talked about, and that God confirms his message through miracles. Therefore, Jesus is God.
Right. So that's part of his message, right? Is whatever Jesus said. And again, we can be maybe nitpicky about, what did he actually say and those kinds of things. But this is where I think that the historical church really comes into play. And this is where Catholics can use the classical method a lot better than I think Protestants can, because we're not just relegating the early church to a bunch of people kind of blindly, reaching around trying to figure out this whole Christianity thing. We see Christianity itself as being the third step, not the Bible, like Norm Geisler would say. The end of his apologetic system was the Bible, not Christianity. Right. So you have to almost have another step built in, because, well, what about Jehovah's Witnesses? What about Mormons? There's lots of groups that misuse the Bible, but if we take the evidence of the early church into consideration, we can see that they came right out of the gate with certain teachings. This wasn't something that took centuries to develop, the way Dan Brown or somebody, would characterize it. So if we end our apologetic system with the truths of Christianity itself, then we're not really bound to whether this or that gospel is reporting exactly accurately, and we can sidestep a lot of those Bart Ehrman type problems. Right. Whereas, for a typical evangelical or Protestant, one little hole in the Bible and the whole system unravels and falls apart. And so many of your modern day skeptics that used to be Christians, that's what happened. They found something in the Bible, they just couldn't deal with it. And it doesn't matter if it has anything to do with the faith or not. It's just, oh my gosh, there's 2 angels, there's 3 angels. The whole thing's over, I think that for the Catholic Christian, we've got a much bigger thing that we're aiming for, and it's a lot harder to take down once the Bible and tradition are seen as part of Christianity and not the cause of Christianity.
Yeah, that's huge. In my opinion, that's huge. And I think, you can sense this tension within Protestant scholarship, where they need to appeal to the earliest Christian community to verify the Gospels, but they don't want to give it too much weight, because that would almost open the door to sacred tradition. Because why would you trust them in this area and not in the other areas? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as you start to realize how much dependency we have on the early church, it gets scary, because if you don't trust the church at least until they gave us the canon of Scripture, then you've got a real problem, because you don't even know what books are in the Bible. But by the time we get the canon of Scripture in the 4th century, at the earliest, you've already got most of Catholic teaching established. So, yeah, that's a real conundrum for Protestants that understand history.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hear the music coming. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people?
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What's your website again?
DouglasBeaumont.com. I got real creative with the title.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And, man, I can't believe the program is already over. Coming up next, we have High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. And it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here at Up and Dojo Lights. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll talk again Monday and this thing that we call Hands-On Apologetics. Talk to you later. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.